Hello everyone. Today I want to look at one of the games from the second round of the Tata Steel Masters section of 2024. This was played between Alireza Firouzja and Parham Maghsoodloo. Firouzja had the white pieces and he started with e4, e5, knight f3 and knight c6, bishop b5 and knight f6. The Berlin defense of the Royal Ootes. It's known to be quite solid for black. White castles, knight takes e4, rook e1 and knight d6. Knight takes e5 and bishop e7. Bishop f1 now, not wanting to give up that good bishop. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5, black castles. d4, opening the diagonal for the bishop and also claiming some space in the center. Bishop f6, pushing the rook back. Rook e1. Now rook e8, trying to exchange some pieces. And bishop f4 now. Before we exchange, we just want to exploit that slight awkward position of that knight on d6, which is actually blocking black's own pawns and the bishop. Takes e1, queen takes e1, and knight e8. Knight c3 now, not bothering with the pawn, just going for development. And bishop takes d4, which is fine. Knight d5 now, trying to create some pressure. Again, there's pressure on c7, there's pressure of knight e7 check, then maybe the knight rounds up to f5, that's all possible. And bishop to b2 is actually a mistake here, because you can't actually grab the rook at all. White can simply play queen b4 and exploit that diagonal to f8. If bishop takes a1, the knight e7 check is very strong. King h8 and knight c6. We're threatening a checkmate on f8 and also threatening the queen on d8. So after knight d5, t6. Blunting that bishop on f4 and also opening lines for our bishop to come out of c8. Bishop g5 here, attacking the queen and also exploiting the fact that the e8 knight would be undefended without the queen and the back rank is weak. Forcing f6, which is okay, but it does open a diagonal for us and that will be important later. Bishop goes to h4. Now bishop takes b2 is possible. And rook b1. White has given up 2 pawns here. Bishop to e5. f4. And this is the critical moment of the game. It's important to get out of this attack with tempo and not to give white any extra moves and play bishop d4 check. After king h1, you can play c6. That knight on d5 is very active, and if black is able to get rid of the knight from that position, it could mean some security for him. So let's say knight e7 check, king to f8, knight c8, queen c8 and queen e4. White is very active and will grab a pawn back because after bishop b6 you have queen into h7. To some extent black's king position is a bit loose. You can have, let's say, queen e6 paving way for the rook to be developed, and bishop d3, all sound. White is slightly better here, could have some chances to push for more than a draw, but it's okay, black can play this. But after f4, Maghsoodloo played one move which looks fine, bishop e6, counter-attacking. And of course, if you are to simply trade on e5, then it need not matter. But there's a move bishop c4. And we had said earlier when f6 was played that a diagonal had been opened, and this is the moment. Now bishop d4 was played, king h1, but now we see the difference. There's something hanging on e6. Bishop e6 gives white one tempo, and that one tempo is all white needs to start an attack. So bishop has to be saved. You have to go back because if bishop takes d5, then after bishop takes d5 and king h8, queen e6 is deadly. The knight on e8 cannot move anywhere and you cannot protect g8. Black will get checkmated. So after king h1, that hanging bishop has to go back to f7 and white gets in queen e4. Again, you can't capture it on d5. You have to save that bishop. So bishop c5 and now knight e7 check comes. You have to save the bishop on f7. So king f8. And there's a wonderful move for white. Perhaps you can pause the video here and see how white can continue that attack. Firouzja played queen into h7. The knight on e7 is hanging and the bishop on c4 is hanging. However, can you really capture any of the pieces? Well, before we see any of the captures, I just want to show what kind of danger lurks in this position. So let's say a random move like c6 were played. There's a beautiful tactic here by white. You have queen g8 check, forcing bishop g8, and then knight g6 is checkmate. So there's a threat of infiltration by the queen, and knight g6 as well. So if you just go back, if the knight were to be captured, if let's say queen captures, then you have queen h8, bishop g8, and queen into g8 will be checkmate. So queen can't capture the knight. If the king captures the knight, you have rook e1 check. If the king were to go back to f8, we'll have the same problem with queen h8 check. So king d7 and bishop takes f7. e8 knight is lost. Bishop e6 forcing king c6. That's also a threat. The king can't capture the knight, so the knight is off limits. Bishop into c4 was played, but before we analyze this move, the best defense would have actually been d5. And what this does is vacate some squares for the knight to come to d6, and the other black pieces can move a little freely. So it gives back a pawn with knight into d5, bishop takes, and queen h8 check first, king f7, and queen h5 check, connecting with the bishop as well, g6 and bishop d5, king g7 and queen f3. So there's a lot of pressure on b7, for instance. So let's say knight d6 here and rook d1. White is better and probably even winning, but it won't be a very straightforward win because black will have some mobility and some counterplay. So black can try to fight for a draw here. This would have been the best. Maghsoodloo played bishop into c4, thinking that let me get rid of at least one of the attackers. But this now allows rook e1. And again we have the threat of infiltration by the white queen and knight g6. Both threats are there. So while white is down a piece, we can notice that the e8 knight is actually a liability because it's blocking the king. The a8 rook for black is not doing anything. So white has more attackers in the game. Now this forces queen into e7. There's no decent defense if you were to just play any random move like a5, for instance. You have queen h8, forcing king f7, and now queen g8 will be checkmate. That's a threat. If black tries something like a bishop e6, trying to tempt white to capture and then play king f7 to gain some tempo, that doesn't work because knight g6 is there, forcing king f7, and you have knight h8, forcing king f8, and now rook into e6. White is perfectly happy with this position. And of course, white is going to checkmate very soon. And in any of the lines, if let's say king e7 here, you can have bishop takes f6. If the king tries to run away, then you have bishop takes d8, loses the queen. And if the knight tries to capture, then g7 falls. And black gets checkmated, forcing king e8 and then queen f7 check. So after rook e1, there is no alternative to capturing and giving up the queen. Queen takes, and rook takes, and king takes. Now if we look at the material, black has a bishop and a knight and a rook in exchange for the queen, and also a pawn. However, queen e4 connects very nicely with the king and the light square bishop. Then after bishop e6, there's f5. At this point, black is completely lost, of course. Rook d8 was played, trying to fight on, but g4. You don't have to capture the bishop immediately. c6 and g5 even, trying to just bust open some lines towards the black king. King f8, f takes e6, and king e7. G takes f6, g takes f6, and queen g4. e5, queen g8, and we can see that white is just keeping black stymied. Queen f7 is a big threat. Bishop d4 was played. Bishop g3 now. Bishop e5. Bishop takes. F takes and h4. The queen is already there at g8, so the h pawn can queen very fast. e4. h5. d4 and queen f7 check. King d7 and e7 even. The rook has to guard the knight, so rook c8, but queen f4 check. You give up the e pawn, but you capture black's e pawn with check. King d7 and you grab the d pawn with check. And after knight g6, h6 was played, and Maghsoodloo resigned here because there is nowhere to stop that pawn. And a very nice victory for Firouzja. This game really shows how one tempo can change the whole tone of the game. So you have to be very careful in chess not to give even an inch to a strong opponent. Well, thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon with the next game.